All right, well, it is noon, so why don't we get started? And thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for logging in. And as we kick off Thrive Court series on mental health, developed by Community Alliance. And before we dive into today's topic, which is Mental Health 101, how mental health conditions developed, I wanted to briefly tell everyone about Thrive Court and what Thrive Court is. Thrive Court is a new project here in Douglas County, developed with support from the Department of Health and Human Services, the Douglas County Attorney's Office, the Public Defender's Office, the Center on Children, Families, and the Law, Court Improvement Project, Community Alliance, Lutheran Family Services, the Nebraska Judicial Branch, and a whole host of private defense attorneys and public and guardian ad litems who have come collectively uh, to seek improved outcomes for state wards and their families, where the main reason for court involvement is parental mental health, a parent who has a serious mental health diagnosis. We are trying to capture these cases from the very beginning and pair these families with case managers who are specially trained and designated to deal with these specific cases, as well as lawyers who have a special interest in these types of cases and have gone through this training series. Families will have monthly court team meetings and more frequent review hearings as part of the process as well. If any lawyers on here are interested in more information on Thrive Court and are interested in being part of the process, please contact me after this webinar. Today's session has been approved for 1 hour of CLE credit. There will be a link in the chat for a certificate of attendance that you can download and save for your records. Also, a recording of today's session will be found on the CIP YouTube channel, and I believe the other 7 series will also be found on the YouTube channel after they've concluded. All right, our presenters today are Stacy Ring and Jeff Liebel with Community Alliance. Stacy is a licensed independent mental health practitioner, and she has been the manager of the Behavioral Health Education and Training Department at Community Alliance since October of 2019. Prior to that, she held many other roles at Community Alliance, including day rehabilitation specialist, SOAR program supervisor, and residential rehabilitation supervisor. Jeff has been the clinical director of Community Alliance since 2020. Prior to that, he was the director of outpatient services at Community Alliance and day treatment manager at Community Alliance. Jeff is also a licensed independent mental health practitioner as well as a licensed clinical social worker. A huge thank you to both of them for developing this 8-part series. So, all right, and without further ado, I'll leave it to the both of you. Thank you.
Hi, Jeff, did you want to say anything before we get started?
No, welcome everyone. Well, yes, welcome everyone. We're so excited to do this project, and we're excited to learn kind of about everyone's story and how we can be supportive and helpful, and want to have kind of conversations. We have a lot of material, but we also kind of want to hear what your ideas are and how we can best help kind of fine tune information to what makes this problem-solving court, the Thrive Court, the best. So thank you.
Yes, and Jeff will be monitoring the chat today. We're kind of taking turns with each session of who's kind of the lead presenter. So he'll be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions or anything that you would like to share or comment on, please feel free to do that at any time, and Jeff will kind of interject as he can. And then feel free to reach out to us between these sessions as well if you have specific things that you would like to make sure we're covering in upcoming trainings, or that you would like just more information on. We'd be happy to help with that as well. So in terms of, let's see, now I'm trying to figure out how to advance this. Okay. There we go. In terms of the things that we're trying to cover today, I believe these were sent out on the email that listed all of the topics. So we're going to talk a little bit about why we think that mental health conditions develop, what things help someone if they are experiencing mental health challenges, or to help protect them from developing them, and then what the different phases of the illness look like, and what can be helpful there. The PowerPoint also has some additional slides. We weren't sure how much time we would have to actually cover it. So we have a few extra slides in there that we may not fully finish, but they'll be in the PowerPoint that we can share with the group as well. Okay, so in terms of why why we think that mental health conditions develop, we believe that it's really kind of a complex interplay between a few things. First and foremost is genetics. For a lot of families, it appears that there is a genetic component. So that, maybe a lot of people in the family seem to have thought disorders like schizophrenia, or struggle with depression or anxiety. And so it really does seem like there is a genetic component to it, but that's not a perfect explanation either, because what we've also seen is that there are studies that have been done on twins, for example, identical twins, who do not necessarily always show 100% concordance rates there, which we would expect to see. So it's got to be a more complicated situation than just genetics. So there's this thought that there is a disease vulnerability model, which means that people have this genetic predisposition that makes them more vulnerable to developing mental health conditions later, but that is not sufficient in and of itself. So like a disease certainty or a prognosis of doom, you might say. There's also a theory that certain prenatal factors may predispose the individual to developing mental health conditions later in life. So some of that could be things like, maternal substance or alcohol use. It could also be things like perhaps exposure to like environmental toxins. Like there was I haven't seen any data that says that this actually happened, but several years back, there was like lead in the water in Flint, Michigan. And so there could be some things like that where maybe a mother was exposed to some sort of environmental toxins, either through like, a water supply thing, or maybe things that they were exposed to at work, like chemicals and things like that. And then there's also a theory that it could also be related to like maternal stress. So how stressed was the mother during pregnancy, or did she have certain nutritional deficits? And some of those things might be related to poverty, but some of those things might be related to maybe she was just really physically ill during the pregnancy and didn't get proper nutrition. So there are some theories that that some of those prenatal factors can be contributing to this as well. And then finally, also things in the kind of postnatal phase of the child's development. So after they're born, things like adoption. There's a lot of research on children who have been adopted, particularly if they were adopted not directly at birth, but even sometimes if they were adopted at birth, with some of those attachment issues that can cause later problems for the child. It also could be related to the safety of their neighborhoods or their homes, if they're witnesses to domestic violence, or if they live in a high crime area. Could also be poverty factors related to nutrition and food security, or housing stability, that may also affect the person. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those particular factors in a couple of slides, but that is another thought. And in terms of that disease vulnerability that we talked about, this slide shows that this is not only for mental health conditions, but it may even be for things also like autism spectrum factors, where there could be a genetic component, or there could be some prenatal components to it. They haven't necessarily tied it actually to anything that happens postnatally on a consistent basis, but there are some theories about perhaps like viruses that the mother may have, or just straight up genetics that seem to be related as well. But like I said, genetics is not enough. We know that to be true. So there may be this intrinsic vulnerability from genetics. There also could be some abnormal brain formations from some of those things that could happen prenatally. But there also appears to need a what we call sometimes the second hit. So the first hit is that genetics or those prenatal factors, and then the second hit is something that happens afterwards. So those psychosocial stressors. So that could be related to stressors in their life. It could be related to things like substance use. And we'll also talk a little bit more about that later as well. And so that initial vulnerability combined with those life stressors seem to, for a lot of people, activate the symptoms. So kind of flip the switch to trigger those mental illnesses or mental health challenges that people may experience. This slide talks about some of those initial negative experiences that people may have. So they call those adverse childhood experiences or adverse childhood events. And this has been studied for a really long time. And how they originally studied this was they'd follow them to see, if bad things happen to you as a child, what happens to you as an adult. They actually started with adults and worked backwards. And so they looked at some adults actually who were in some pretty successful careers, and they gave them a survey of a bunch of different things that could happen to you when you were growing up and how many of those things happened to the individual. And what they found was that the more of those things that happened in your early life, the more likely you were to develop mental health conditions and or addiction issues later in your life. So those individuals were more likely to be depressed or anxious or have alcohol use or substance use disorders as adults, based on what they believe, what they theorize, was things that happened earlier in their lives. Now, when we think of these adverse childhood experiences, some of them really do seem to be related to things that physically harmed a child, or sexually or emotionally harmed a child. But there are other things that can happen that are adverse childhood events that aren't necessarily someone's choice or within someone's control. So, for example, if a primary caregiver in the child's life dies or is seriously ill and is not able to be fully present to that child, that is a traumatic event. It could also be things like living in poverty, the incarceration of a parent. Sometimes, the parent is in and out of the house multiple times for either incarcerations, even military deployments could be for children, definitely. Even if they're not necessarily not amicable, it's still a traumatic disruption for the person. Violence in not only in their home, but in their communities or in their schools can be traumatic. So looking at all of those things, the more of those experiences that a child has, the more vulnerable then they become to developing mental health conditions later. So when we look at that, we also see that not only is it about developing mental health conditions, but there are also some pretty serious physical health risks for individuals who have had a lot of substance use challenges. As you can see at the top of that slide as well, people with 4 or more of those adverse childhood experiences also are 14 times more at risk for attempting suicide. Also, smoking, earlier sexual activity in their lives. So there are a lot of things that we should be looking for as well. And then, like when I saw the triangle diagram, I really like that because it's very Maslow's hierarchy of needs looking, but it's actually the opposite. So these adverse childhood experiences really kind of set the stage. The more that the person has, it disrupts their development. It disrupts their social, emotional, and cognitive development and skill building. It also kind of predisposes them to develop some unhealthy habits like smoking, like, sexual promiscuity, poor nutrition, bad sleep habits, and things like that. And then that all predisposes them to disease, disability, and other social problems, which can result in an earlier death. So I think that's important to keep in mind when we are looking for the why are these conditions happening.
Stacey, if I
Yeah,
can jump in.
yeah,
So the other thing I think about with this too, and we'll talk some more about this next week with the trauma discussion, but the other thing I think about is the people coming into court are very likely to have not only been a victim to some of these stories, but then generationally. And so it's not surprising then that to lift people out of this pattern, it's going to be complicated and small steps. Because for some, if they've had 3 generations of some of these challenges and come into the court system, I'm being Captain Obvious here, but it's not going to be as easy as some people would think to be able to help them to make life changes. And so, because this creates this, you're almost at a disadvantage immediately, and then furthermore complicates kind of your ability to make healthy choices and to be able to step out of that kind of cycle of trauma and mental illness.
absolutely. Thank you. Yes. Now, there are some things that can help the person, even with these adverse childhood events, to still be resilient and to sort of protect them from, again, this genetic vulnerability and these adverse childhood events. So those are commonly known as protective factors. So overall, some people just seem to be more resilient. They just have a more resilient personality, demeanor, outlook on life. They just seem to be kind of like the Energizer Bunny of resilience. They just keep going. Also, problem-solving skills. So the ability to think flexibly and to look for solutions rather than to feel powerless, hopeless, overwhelmed. So to really just kind of look for, okay, what do we do now? Or how can we solve this now? Or what are our options and resources? Also, the presence or knowledge of or ability to access healthcare services. So some people just aren't in a place that there are services. There are lots of areas of Nebraska that just have nothing. So, for hundreds of miles, there's just nothing. Also, they're, knowing about those services. So it's one thing for them to be there, but knowing where they are and what they do and how they could be helpful and then how to access them. Those are all different questions and problems. But somebody who's got access to them, who knows how to access them, and who knows how they could be helpful is going to be much more protected from the impacts of all of these other things that could pull them down. Another thing that can be helpful is those, I mean, this again is kind of Jeff's phrase, Captain Obvious, but people who have support systems, family support systems, friendships, in the case of children, healthy adults, even if the primary caregivers are not able to be those people for the child, having somebody who can be, whether that is, at their school, in their neighborhood, at their place of worship, if they're connected to something like a faith community. And then safety in their homes, safety in their communities, and safety in their schools. So the places that they're going, are those places safe for them? And as we know, unfortunately, for a lot of not only the people that are in front of you, but a lot of people in the world, the answers to a lot of those questions are no. Those places are not consistently safe for them. And then also having a sense of belongingness. So feeling like you're a part of something outside and larger than yourself. Because then it's a little bit more like that community support has you, like you have resources, you have connections of people that you can access and draw from, and also you feel like you're contributing to something, or there's a bigger purpose to your life and to some things that are happening. And then another thing that can be a protective factor for mental health issues is a belief system. So whether it's your culture or whether it's a religious belief system that is, again, very kind of community, like we're all in this together kind of philosophy, but also that is very much against things like suicidality. Or unhealthy behaviors in some ways. Certain religions or cultural groups really do kind of shun substance use, or dishonoring your body and things like that. And so some of those things can, for some people, be a protective factor as well. Um, okay, so moving on to the next thing, one of the things we wanted to talk about today were the stages of mental illness. So people don't usually kind of like dive into the most severe presentations of mental health issues. So I have two slides here. One is just kind of general stages of mental illness in terms of severity. The other one is specific to psychosis, because there's a little bit of a difference with psychosis, and that would be like thought disorders like schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder. So this one is just more kind of a general overview of stages of mental illness. And it's a graphic that's entitled Before Stage 4, because really what it's from a group called Mental Health America that has a toolkit every year in October for Mental Illness Awareness Month, and also in May for Mental Health Month. And this was one year, I think it was 2015, where their theme was about these stages, and we want to catch things before stage 4, because that's when things are at their worst. And if we can catch them earlier, not only is the person still very functional and still very connected to a lot of their roles and supports, but also the interventions are much more low intensity, that allow the person to continue a lot of their regular roles. If we wait till stage 4, not only is this actually life-threatening at that point for a lot of people, but also the things that we can do to try to help them are really kind of, they're not only more intense, but they also require that the person invests almost like a full-time commitment, like 24/7, where they're more likely to be in residential programming. So they're not living at home in the community. They're living in 24-hour staffed facilities. They're going to, like day hospital or day treatment programs, so they can't work. They're usually, seeing therapists and doctors, and are on high levels of medication or other types of treatment. So if we can catch it before stage 4, if we can catch it at stage 1, the person is still very functional, and they're just, they're dealing with some additional stress, but the interventions are much more manageable, much more low cost as well. And the person is still very connected to things that can be ongoing supports like work, community involvement, family relationships, and all of those things that remain protective factors to them. So stage 1 is just kind of more mild symptoms and just kind of early warning signs. So the person may not seem like themselves. They may not feel like things are as smooth as they normally would be. They may notice that their sleep is disrupted, or that they're having a harder time motivating themselves maybe to get out of bed or go to work or school and things like that. And so in that stage, we can do a lot of just kind of like even at a primary care level, talking to the person, maybe looking at, would an antidepressant or a sleep medication help you? Do you want to talk to somebody in therapy? Those kind of maybe a support group even. And then if we go into stage 2, this is where the symptoms are getting to the point where it is interfering with the person's daily functioning. So they may be missing days of work or school. They may be withdrawing from like social events and activities that they typically would attend and participate in. These things are becoming kind of self-reinforcing. So it's like I missed today at work. So if I get up tomorrow and I don't really feel any better, I might miss tomorrow too. And then that also complicates maybe my financial stability. So now I have more stress on me, and things like that. So at stage 2, medication management and therapy and support groups are all still going to be helpful, but we may need more of those. We may need to go from primary care med management to psychiatry if the first line of interventions aren't working. And again, we may have to be looking at like, do they need FMLA to keep their jobs and those kinds of things as well. And then if we get to stage 3, this is where we would see people with increased severity possibly being in the hospital, requiring that level of treatment. It could mean that they're not able to work at all. So they may, have had to drop out of school or lost their jobs at this point. So things really feel like they're falling apart. And that also reinforces itself because the more things that are going wrong, it can feel very hopeless and overwhelming. So it's like, I might just as well throw my hands up and just stay in bed and, kind of cover up and hope that it all goes away. So those kinds of things, usually will require more interventions. So again, it might be like a day hospital or a day program. It might be in-home supports for mental health and things like that. So stage 3 is pretty rough. And then stage 4, really, the person's symptoms are so severe that they are in many cases life-threatening. So the person may be suicidal. They may not be safe for others because maybe they're so non-functional they can't parent or be active in activities of those of daily living like that. So we want to look at those things, like it says on the slide too. It could be, not only homelessness and unemployment, but it could be, hospitalization and even incarceration. If, a lot of times people who are struggling with mental illness that can't afford or can't keep their job, they can't afford a place to live. So they're sleeping in uninhabited places and getting in trouble for that. So they're getting arrested for trespassing or they're getting arrested for shoplifting because they need something to eat. So, then they may be incarcerated really for trying to survive. So that's a little bit about the stages of just kind of general mental health conditions. And then if we look at specifically the stages of psychosis, this is, I think, kind of a lesser known progression for people who have schizophrenia or develop something similar to that in their life. So some people may have like a family member who has schizophrenia, and so they may be kind of always on the lookout of, am I going to develop this? Is this a genetic condition, especially if multiple people in their family have it? And so, they'll have a typically normal period of development that goes usually into early or middle adolescence. And then they have this prodromal phase that comes in. Now, the timing of it really couldn't be worse because it looks like being a teenager, if you're describing it out loud. So it's like the person may kind of just want to spend more time alone in their room rather than being engaged with their family. They may want to not go to school as often, or be kind of, struggling with attentiveness and getting their work done. So their grades may be, falling a little bit. They may even be pulling back socially, which to a family member may be like, oh, well, it's probably like friend drama or, something like that. And so it looks like a lot of things that you would normally expect in adolescence, just growing pains. But it's actually that the person is starting to experience these what they don't know and we don't really know as symptoms, because things are starting to change in their brains. So things are not connecting the way they did before. Things are not working the same way they did before. And so this individual then starts struggling. And then at some point, for males, it tends to be a little bit earlier. For females, maybe a little bit later, they will have their first psychotic break where the symptoms are really clear then because they're either experiencing auditory or visual hallucinations, maybe severe paranoia or delusions. And so this gets very activated for them, and it's really kind of impossible to ignore it or explain it in another way. What we unfortunately see for a lot of people also is this activation of that first episode of psychosis for a lot of adolescents tends to happen when they first utilize marijuana. So we have a first episode psychosis program here, and what our staff in that program say is that so many of the families say they were just fine until they used marijuana, and then it activated this psychosis, and unfortunately, you can't put it back. Like just stopping the use of marijuana doesn't reset the person's brain. It's like that was the switch that got flipped, and we can't send it back. So that's something that a lot of people don't know about, but it can definitely be an activating issue for individuals as well. Any questions about those stages of mental illness?
Stacey, I also think the further confounding this is not only are we talking about the mom and dad or the caregiver that may have this mental health, these challenges and be working through the stages, but their child may also. And so it predisposes them to not be able to see these early stages in their child because they have their own story. And I think that then is that opportunity for the community, for the judicial system to say, how do we step in and provide some of that observation and assessment as well, which I know you all already do, but that does demonstrate how complicated this is because what we know is useful is even more complicated, this early catching things earlier in life.
Absolutely, yes. Are there any questions in the chat that we need to cover yet, Jeff?
No, I did want to highlight, we did talk about the also involvement in the judicial system is another challenge in addition to kind of the genetics, in addition to kind of life stressors. And so people in the system, I'm sure are likely more likely to maintain or remain in the system without substantial interventions. And I just applaud y'all the work that you're doing because I think it is easy to get frustrated when it seems so obvious to people, to the rest of us, which is good. We know healthy things versus unhealthy, but to the many of the families we're engaging with, it is not as obvious. And so it takes so much more effort to engage.
Absolutely.
Daniel did have a question in the chat.
Yes.
The question is, can a male have their first episode in their 30s or is it younger?
Absolutely, they can. Like statistically speaking, males tend to have a little earlier onset. So theirs tend to be kind of mid to late teens into their early to mid 20s, and women tend to be, maybe a little bit behind that. But honestly, there are always those kind of anecdotal stories where somebody was fine until later in life. And again, that prodromal phase can just last longer. And then, that activating thing, and activation does not have to be related to substance use either. I mean, it's just kind of anecdotally, we're just seeing more of that, where it does seem to be related to that, but it can also be life stressors, that finally the person just gets to that point. And honestly, we saw a lot of that during the pandemic, where not necessarily with psychosis, but with mental health symptoms in general, where people who had previously kind of been very resilient people hit kind of the end of their ability to be resilient. And they struggled with anxiety and depression and isolation, and a lot of things started kind of falling apart and getting a lot harder for them. And so the same thing can happen with psychosis. And then I see a question about how likely is it after the first episode that a person will have another episode. For a lot of people, like they're they will continue the illness. So they may have, exacerbations of their psychotic symptoms, but the goal really is to try to catch it early and to get the right treatment on board and get the right wraparound services for the individual. So like here at Community Alliance and at the Med Center at UNMC, both of us have a first episode psychosis program that provides the individual med management with a psychiatrist, as well as offering therapy services for the individual and for the family, because this is something that the person needs an active support system to manage. In our model, also, they have a care coordinator that works with them. They also have a job coach that helps them stay on track with developmental activities to build employment skills. They also have part of the care coordination as well is if they're still in school to make sure they get educational accommodations to complete their either high school or college coursework. They also, work with a peer too, somebody who has been there, because a lot of people feel very alone, that like I'm the only person that experiences these things, and not just the kind of clear symptoms of psychosis, like the hallucinations and the delusions, but also with the other symptoms that go along, where the person may struggle to organize their thoughts, or may struggle with motivation and goal-directed activity and things like that. So having somebody who has experienced that can be very helpful as well.
So it's the other thing about first episode psychosis, there is clear research that shows the earlier we can intervene, it will decrease the severity and the longevity and maybe require less medication and fewer episodes. And so, again, there's great research that says the sooner we can engage with individuals and families, that can help prevent the seriousness or the severity of the illness later on. It doesn't necessarily guarantee we can stop that psychosis, but it can definitely improve a person's ability to maintain school and work, to maintain their functioning in the community, and decrease the level of need for how much medication they're on or other kinds of kind of debilitating effects from those illnesses. So there are definitely a lot of factors. I'm kind of looking through the questions quick here.
Like Kendall's question, is the deterioration inevitable or preventable with treatment after the first break? And it's not inevitable, but just like with anything, like the person is going to have a period where things are going to feel like they're falling apart because they're not how they've always been, so it feels like a huge disconnect from how my life was to how it is now. And some of it, like, unfortunately, psychiatry, yes, it's it's medicine, but it's not an exact science. So sometimes there's a lot of trial and error about what works and what doesn't. There's oftentimes a lot of resistance on the part of the person. Like, what teenager wants to have a chronic illness? Nobody. And especially one that affects your brain, because there's a lot of stigma about that too. In comparison to if someone had, another type like diabetes. It's like, okay, my friends are all supportive about, the food choices that I have to make, or that, they understand what I have to do if I have a seizure disorder, and things like that. But it's different when it's a mental illness. And so a lot of people, will struggle with that as well. Like, I don't want this to be wrong with me. And I don't want to think that for the rest of my life, I'm going to have to take medications or see a psychiatrist or have other things, going on. Like in the case of, for some people, it could, derail some of their future plans, like with the military or things like that too. So, it's just a lot for people to try to manage when they're at a place that they don't have a lot of life experience to do that yet. So, but it's not inevitable for sure. It's, but if we can get them connected to those programs that can help wrap support around them and their families and their school and everybody else, we can get them the best outcomes possible. Let's see. Okay. Any other questions? I think we're caught up on the
Yeah.
chat now. Okay, so the next slide that I have here is related to how symptoms look. So a lot of times clients are not aware of their symptoms, at least initially, because they come on so slowly. If you've ever heard the parable of the boiled frog, it's like how you boil a frog is you put them in like regular temperature water and you slowly increase the temperature of the water, and by the time they realize that it's dangerous to them, they are kind of powerless to get out. It's the symptoms kind of do the same thing. They just kind of ramp up on intensity. Every once in a while, you'll get somebody that was like, no, it was like, I went to bed fine and I woke up with this, this symptom. It was like it just came on me. But for most people, it does tend to creep up on them, that things just kind of start getting a little bit more unmanageable over time. So for hallucinations, again, for a lot of people, they do seem real. If you've ever seen the movie A Beautiful Mind, that was the story of John Nash, it kind of talks about how he experienced pretty significant psychosis with delusions and paranoia and hallucinations. And he would see things and hear things that weren't there. And years after his story kind of was out there, somebody asked him, "You're a brilliant guy. How did you not know that these things weren't real?" And what he said to them was, well, because they came to me in the same way everything I know about the rest of the world and math and science came to me, which is through my brain, and I trust my thoughts. And I didn't know that I couldn't trust my perceptions. So so for a lot of people, when they're experiencing hallucinations, what you'll notice is that they may not be looking at you. So they may be looking, over off to the side. They may be looking behind them, because they're trying to see whatever they think they're seeing, or turn to whoever they hear speaking or whatever noise they're attending to. So it can be also, you could see them, if they're hearing somebody, they may be responding to somebody. So they may not be saying things out loud, but you may see their mouth moving, like they're silently responding. So that can be one thing. Also, if they're like shifting a lot, some of that can be anxiety, but some of it could be that they're uncomfortable because of all this other stuff going on that they're experiencing. And when people have visual hallucinations, it doesn't have to be seeing a person. For some people, it's shadows, or it's like motion out of like their peripheral vision or something, but it's things that aren't there, that other people aren't experiencing. And they may not hear like a voice commanding them. It may just be that they hear noise. For some people, it's they hear their name being said, or they think they do. It could be that they feel like they hear somebody's conversation. Some people do experience like whispers or commands and things like that, but not everybody does. And then in terms of delusions, I think this is a little harder right now because there's a lot of conspiracy theory out there. So it used to be like, well, if people are talking about things that are odd or that don't, don't seem like they align with like science or what we know about the world or things like that, we're like, that was probably delusional. But there's a lot of things going on out in the world right now that may not be delusional. They may be, kind of conspiracy theories. So it's a little more difficult to discern sometimes, um, but usually they'll be talking about some odd beliefs or some plans. They may have like there was a guy I worked with for a while that he had a belief in his mind that he was on some kind of special mission, but he couldn't really tell me like what he was supposed to do or what was at the end of it. But he had this belief that to get where he was supposed to go, he had to follow it was like a certain number of blue cars and then red cars or something like that. And so he actually got lost in the middle of Nebraska and his family couldn't find him for like a couple of days because he didn't have a cell phone and he was just following these cars kind of until he ran out of gas somewhere. So that was like a delusional belief that he had. So that's an example of how a delusion might look where the person is talking about, maybe being on a special mission or having some kind of special ability or power that probably they don't have. There's also avolition and amotivation, and those things probably are things that we see a lot in clients, but we don't label them as that. So where the person may be able to say that they have a goal, so they may be able to say, yes, I want to get stable housing for me and my family, or yes, I want to go get a job or go back to school or whatever, but they may not be able to conceptualize the steps that it's going to take to get there. So yeah, it's great to want to go get a job or to get stable housing, but if you don't know the steps that it's going to take to apply for a Section 8 voucher or apply for different apartments that are open, or a lot of our clients are really good at going and applying for and getting jobs, but they haven't really thought through the logistics of it, of how am I going to get there? Or this is an overnight job and I have really bad sleep issues, so this is probably not going to work for me. So some of those things kind of go in with this too. And then with amotivation, they may really just, physically almost feel unable to get up and move, or unable to start a task or finish a task, because either of the physical energy involved or the mental processing tasks. And then kind of a third thing here is the anhedonia, which is where they don't feel pleasure. So a lot of us, on a particularly kind of lazy day or a day where we didn't sleep well the night before, maybe like, I gotta go take a shower. And it feels like a chore, but it feels better after you've done it. And so it's kind of reinforcing like, okay, I'll feel better after I do this, so I'll just do it. And yep, sure enough, I feel better. But for clients who experience this anhedonia, things that would normally feel better having done them don't feel better. So they don't feel better after having taken a shower or brushing their teeth. They don't feel better after having cleaned their house and seeing it clean. And so if you struggle with motivation and energy already, and then you put the little bit that you had into this activity and it doesn't feel better, you're less likely to put that energy in to the activity in the future. But when we look at the lack of goal-directed activity, the lack of motivation, and the lack of that experience of pleasure, what it really looks like from the outside, and sometimes what the client reports seeing or judging themselves to be, is lazy. Because it feels like a lot of excuses. It feels like a lot of kind of like Eeyore in, the Winnie the Pooh situation, that it's always, kind of like the down and glum kind of view of the world and the reasons why I can't, versus, like, let's get up and do it. And it's really related to these symptoms, but a lot of people see it as a personal weakness. And for a lot of people on the outside, it looks like the person isn't trying, but really they probably are. And then for anxiety, it's usually the person may look distracted because there's just so much going on inside. They may be pacing, they may be sweating, they may have like look physically tense because they're just so anxious and on edge. And they may do like repeated checking. They may talk about like, are you hot? My heart is racing, or they may be breathing very shallow and fast and heavy. So looking for those kind of things. In pressured speech, the person may just keep talking. You can't find a place to interrupt them, or they may interrupt other people. They may be talking super fast, almost to the point that you can't understand them sometimes. And with racing thought, that's where their brain just kind of won't stop. It's just spinning thoughts over and over. Sometimes it's the same thought kind of amping itself up. Sometimes it's thoughts about lots of different stuff that they can't break. And then for depressed mood, most of us wouldn't know what that looks like or feels like. So primary symptoms there are just feelings of sadness, emptiness, worthless, hopelessness, helplessness, all of that negative stuff. Okay.
Stacy, can I jump in here? I was just going to say, I think when we think about this too, and you think you're starting to notice some of these symptoms or these situations, or others are starting to notice it, sending them to that counselor, sending them to a therapist, sending them to psychiatrists to get evaluations. And I would say also, we have a ILP program where we get people kind of court ordered for substance use evaluations, and sometimes they're not always fully honest the first time. So it's okay to think, okay, I've tried something, but maybe we need to have multiple attempts and just continue to have that conversation with people about what they might need for support. Because sometimes there's a lot of self-doubt or a lot of self-judgment. And so it may take more than once or twice or even 3 times to have someone get to services and for them to consider taking advantage of opportunities for support.
Absolutely. I know we're getting down on time here. We've only got about 7 minutes left. Jeff, I think you're sending the PowerPoint, right? Or it's already been shared.
Yes, I
So you'll
will. I will
have the
upload that in a
whole
minute.
PowerPoint, and I put my notes in the notes section of the slides. So there are a few things that we won't be able to get to today, but I encourage you, if you're interested in this topic a little bit more, to look at. There's a video that has Anderson Cooper doing a hearing voices simulation, which I think is really interesting because most of us have seen him in a different light. And so watching him do this is really kind of interesting to see him on very typical tasks, like, doing a paper and pencil worksheet, or folding paper following directions, or trying to remember words, even trying to remember the last 4 presidents. Which is kind of his job. And so it's very interesting, and he does a really good job of narrating what he's struggling with, what he's kind of drawn to do versus what he's actually doing. And so I would encourage you to look at that and think about, like, he signed up for this. He knew what was going to happen. He knew how long it was going to last. Imagine what it would be like if you didn't have those assurances, and how difficult would it be to function. And then also you can look at him and see, based on his behavior, did you see any signs that he was experiencing hallucinations and things like that, based on how distracted he was or where he was looking versus where he might normally look. There's also a slide in here that talks about the professional interventions that can be helpful to people who are needing different levels of treatment. So it breaks it down into treatment, rehabilitation services to help them get their levels of functionality back in different areas, and then also supportive services that are usually more non-professional services, maybe peer provided, that can help the individual and or their family system. And then there are a couple of videos in there that I have that are from a woman named Patricia Deegan, who's she has her doctorate in counseling, and she is someone who has lived experience with schizophrenia. She was diagnosed at 17 after having a psychotic break her senior year in high school over Christmas, actually. And she was on track to be a varsity well, she was a varsity athlete, but going to school on on an athletic scholarship, and her goal was to become a women's sports coach. And the doctor at the time told her, "You have schizophrenia and you will not go to school." And so the first video in there is talking about kind of a turning point where she went from that hopeless, very symptomatic place to like taking the first steps in trying to rebuild her life and what that was. So that's kind of a nice video. And then also, there's another video towards the end that talks about the collaborative care model. And so where it's got the person at the top and then the support people underneath of it, which it sounds very much like the Thrive Court is designed around a similar model where everything that's happening is really to support and help that person or that family versus putting the professionals above it and then having that person kind of at the bottom. And so the video there is kind of talking about from a lived experience of somebody in that system, what the difference for that made for her. And then the very last slide that I have is in the notes section, there's something that she wrote about kind of describing how people get better and how even when it looks like there's nothing going on or it looks like they're just kind of checked out, that there may be a lot going on under the surface that you don't see and you don't know about. So we have to continue to believe in this energy of life that the individuals in front of us have, and that they're maybe in a lot of cases waiting for the conditions around them to improve to the point that they can kind of root their recovery and start blooming. So that's another thing that's in there as well. So those are just kind of some final slides that we have in there, as well as a slide on like person first language, which you probably know, and some steps about how to be helpful, because I think a lot of us get into that trap where in the interest of time, we're like, well, just go do this. And one of the things that I hear Jeff say a lot of the times, if it was that simple, they would have already done it. Or if they were able to do it, they would have already done it. They wouldn't be sitting here in front of us. So, a lot of times they need a lot more than that. They need somebody to actually, walk alongside them in this journey to help them learn the skills that they may have never had or that they may have lost along the way, and to rebuild that resilience as well. So, okay. All right. I think we're 2 minutes away.
Thank you, anybody. Any final questions? I did upload, or I did send the PowerPoint to Tracy. So hopefully that should be getting there if it hasn't already. And then, yeah, so we're just excited for this opportunity.
All right. Well, it is almost 1 o'clock. Thank you everyone for joining, and please remember to sign up for next week, September 17th, 12 to 1. We'll have part 2 of the series, how trauma can impact mental health. And I'm sure I recognize everyone in the chat working with people in the system. I'm sure that will be very helpful to everyone. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.